Welcome to this session, Are We Making a Meal of GM Foods? I'm Rob Lyons and I'm the Science and Technology Director at the Academy of Ideas. 20 years ago, there was widespread anxiety about genetically modified GM foods. Newspapers referred to them as Frankenfoods and consumers were suspicious of them, in part because of a vociferous campaign against GM foods by environmentalists. This campaign continues most notably in the case of golden rice. But since then, the technology has moved on enormously and GM crops are widely grown around the world, except notably in the UK and particularly in Europe. So are GM foods safe, both for our health and for the environment? Why has there been such resistance to them in some parts of the world while they flourish elsewhere? Is it time for the UK and Europe to fully embrace GM? And do we need to utilise every means to increase food production when the world's population is heading towards 10 billion? So this session is going to be a little bit different from the earlier ones in that we've asked Xeon Lights here, to do a sort of mini lecture for 10 minutes to introduce the subject. And then I've asked Harry, Ed and Adam to give their responses to that. So Xeon Lights, science communicator and environmentalist, and has become one of the leading advocates for nuclear power in the UK. But it's also well known for challenging many other green orthodoxies. Xeon wrote a very good Substack for the Academy of Ideas. If you follow that, if you're not, you should, about like challenging all these green orthodoxies. So welcome, Xeon. Next is Harry Wilkinson. He's head of policy at the Global Warming Policy Foundation. To my left is Ed Rennie, who's the founder and co-director of Climate Debate UK, as well as being a political strategist. And finally, Adam Hibbert is chair of the South East Social Democratic Party with a particular interest in food policy. He's an author and journalist and a corporate communications leader. So, Xeon, if you would like to get the ball rolling.
Hello, everybody. Hope you've had a good festival and thanks for showing up. Can you hear me okay? Thanks for showing up when I know it's late on a Sunday. So I'm here to talk to you about so-called Frankenfoods. First of all, what are Frankenfoods? So this is a really clever bit of marketing that was, I think it originated from one of the many activist groups. I think it might have been Greenpeace, actually. And it became in the early stages of the... Sorry, this microphone is just... it's wobbling, so... Okay. I don't know if my voice is wobbling. Okay. So... You probably know me, some of you might know me as previously an anti-nuclear activist, as very, very active as an activist in that arena. And if you're in those groups, you also tend to also be against so-called GMOs, genetically modified organisms. You don't necessarily know what they are, but you're told that they're very unnatural, that there are things like Frankenfoods, that they will make you sick. So I used to believe all of those things. I didn't actively protest it, but it was just like a belief system that we had in our kind of activist circles. And there was a lot of misinformation spread by groups like Greenpeace, telling us that, they'll make you sick, they're dangerous, they're causing all these illnesses in people, there's cover-ups of the data. So those movements and that messaging has been so powerful for so long that it does now impact policy all over the world. And we are not exempt from that. So it's an interesting thing, really, because if you just look at what is a genetically modified organism? Humans have always kind of, messed with the food chain. We've always modified things. Even if it was because we were selecting for desirable traits of, animals or food types, we were modifying. We've always done that. And then you have hybridization and other methods of kind of selective breeding. We've always done that as well, but people kind of considered it to be more natural because it's farmers experimenting, on their farms. Later on, we discovered that we can do this through DNA. We can change the DNA of a food type, or we can kind of say, okay, this food type is not thriving in this environment. Can we take a gene from something else and put it in there and modify the DNA to make it hardier in that environment or to increase crop yield, which are the two main reasons that, kind of have these genetically modified technologies. And you'd think that when that was discovered, that would be a really incredible thing because so many mouths have been fed through the discovery and application of this technology. But unfortunately, those activist groups that I was mentioning, that some of which I was a part of, really clever in demonizing this technology. And it kind of depends, I think, in what circles you're, whether you've heard it or not. But the amount of misinformation I heard around, how dangerous it is and how it's corrupting our food chain and it's not natural and all of this stuff, it's really taken hold to the point that even some politicians believe in it. And as mentioned earlier, you have bans actually across the EU. So although the EU technically does allow genetically modified organisms if they pass certain regulatory requirements, there are still countries that have bans. So Germany, Austria, Luxembourg, they outright don't allow this to be grown in their soil. And some countries are pushing to have labelling on foods to say that they've been modified, which is a really odd thing when you think about the fact that all food has been modified at some point. Like, we have been modifying foods in some shape or form for thousands of years, actually. If you look at something like a banana or a carrot as you know it, and then you look at the original of what it actually used to look like, it's a different food essentially. So so it's an interesting thing to say, wow, people are getting sick from eating these foods. We're all eating these foods. So unless you actually have labeling, and then a lot of us follow the labeling and give up certain foods, we are eating them, we are exposed to them. So there have been multiple studies because of that and because of the fear-mongering, and all of the studies have found that they're safe and they're not harming people and it's completely fine. Now that brings me to, well, why do we need them at all? Like, yes, okay, they can be better for the environment, they can increase crop yield so they can feed more people. But actually, there are some ways in which this technology is life-saving. And that's where we have the example of something like golden rice, which was mentioned earlier. So golden rice, if you don't know, it's just a normal white rice, but it has beta-carotene added to it so that it has a high content of vitamin A. So when you eat it, you get the vitamin A. Now, it might not matter here because we have quite good diets, quite easy to have a good diet here, but across countries, other countries, specifically in Africa and some parts of Asia, they don't get enough vitamin A in their diets. And it's not as simple as we'll give them a better diet. We're talking about people that don't have access to food, they don't have the incomes to be able to afford a variety of food. A lot of them are, there might be rice farmers. What they do eat is a lot of rice. And in some of these parts of the world, they eat rice 3 times a day. So if you can fortify that rice, 500,000, that's 500,000 children a year go blind from lack of vitamin A. So imagine if you can fortify that rice that they're eating anyway. One bowl of golden rice gives you 60% of the amount that you need in a day. This is a really huge deal. So you'd kind of think, wow, what an incredible discovery. Is this new? If you've never heard of it, you might be thinking, is this new? No, it was discovered 20 years ago. Then why isn't it out there? Why don't some of the poorest people in the world have access to something that is life-saving? Because half of those people with the deficiency, that 500,000, half of them then are dead within a year. They die because of the deficiency. Like, it is that extreme. And the reason why, I'm sorry to tell you, is the activism has been very successful. You've had, people slashing crops in the Philippines, then governments imposing bans all over the world. A lot of countries have just fallen for the fear-mongering, and and the irony is that, this would save so many lives and particularly help so many children. But there is a huge scare campaign against golden rice. And it's not been feasible to go and give that to people. Now, I've spoken to some of the activists who are against it, and I've said, what are your reasons? And they've said, we just think, it would be fairer for those people to have a diverse diet. I mean, I'm not disagreeing. That would be great. I wish that every person in the world had access to 5 a day and what they need. But the frank fact is that not everybody has that ability or quality of life or access. And so we have, a life-saving technology that just because it's a so-called Frankenfood, just because it's genetically modified, has just not been rolled out. And I think it's tragic, actually. I think it's tragic. So that's why I started talking about GM food, because I realized that misinformation is not harmless. That misinformation has had repercussions all over the world. Now, there is a little bit of backlash and it's actually happening out of necessity. So some countries that previously had a ban, like Kenya, are lifting that, because what they've realized is actually they're experiencing a lot of drought, and because of that they need better technology. They need crop resistant varieties, and so they've lifted their ban on growing GM crops now, because actually they're kind of desperate, and if they can plant things that survive drought conditions, again, this is life-saving for people whose incomes and the incomes that they need to feed their children and things relies on being able to grow those crops. So I know it probably sounds a bit labouring the point, and you're probably thinking we all know what farmers are, Zion, but actually I don't think most people do think about it. I don't think most people do think about what it's like to live in one of these countries and all you've really got is your crops. Your crop varieties are really important. If you have something that comes along, if something comes along and wipes out your crop, will you eat that year? Will your family eat that year? No. That's it. No. If you can grow something like, here's a good example, Bt cotton in India. This is a variety of cotton that is resistant to fungicide. So what they found was with Bt cotton that actually it massively improved the crop yield. So they're getting more income because they're growing more and they can use the land more efficiently. And because of that, a lot of farmers over there become very pro-GM. But then you have the activists who are not farmers typically, or not in that sense, even if they garden in their backyards, who are, from a different background, kind of claiming to speak for the farmers. And I think there's a big problem there, and that we should we should take it right back to the root of the argument. Just consider, what is this technology and what is its purpose? And does the potential good it could do outweigh the bad? And that's kind of where I've landed on it, that actually, yes, it can, but not if we continue to ban it.
Thank you very much. Great start. Harry, your thoughts?
Thank you very much. Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and a particular honour to follow Zion Lights, because as someone who in public life actually was a green activist and then has become such a articulate advocate for nuclear energy and other good causes, is something that has been very difficult. People who were aligned to her before have criticized her. And, we have so few examples of people in public life today, publicly changing their mind, and that being, something we should celebrate. How often do we hear politicians being able to change their minds? So that you have been a great example in that respect, and what you've been doing is fantastic. So to come on to the topic of GM crops. Now, I want to look at it from a general perspective. When we see, GM crops is one example of a technological development, and technological development is why we're all here. Pre the Industrial Revolution, the global population had not been growing particularly fast, for hundreds of thousands of years, and now it's boomed, and that's because we've had all these technologies that have come along and allowed us to actually thrive in our environment. And that's led to enormous improvements in our welfare, and it has meant that the earth can now sustain far more people than it could before. So we are here today thanks to technological developments, and technological progress should always be seen as a huge benefit. But unfortunately, there is this strand within environmentalism that views people as the problem, growth as the problem, improvements in living standards as the problem. And the issue of golden rice has been brought up, so I won't say too much about it. But no, I think it is worth reflecting on the fact that, we've got the 250 to 500,000 cases of blindness in children, that could be saved from those horrible conditions. We've got, in the early 1990s, it was estimated maybe 2 million people annually were dying from vitamin A deficiency. Perhaps that's gone down now to 266,000, according to PNAS, not my acronym, but that's the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in the United States. It's a huge number of people who are being affected in the most horrible way. And we saw the reaction of Greenpeace. The Philippines was an example of a country taking a more progressive attitude, saying we're going to allow golden rice. But, they had this enormous campaign against it. They've reversed that decision very sadly. And, Greenpeace said this was a monumental win. Greenpeace, unfortunately, and to put it bluntly, they are responsible for children dying on a huge scale. Maybe they are the child killers of our time. Unfortunately, that is the response. We have something that can save children's lives, and we should use that opportunity and seize that technology. One of the things people worry about is GM crops cross-pollinating other plants, and they worry about the knock-on impacts on ecosystems. But that's something that regulators look at. And, that is not something that's ignored. It's something that's assessed very carefully. And when regulators are confident that that's not going to happen, that's when the approval for those strands goes ahead. In the United States, over 90% of all maize crops, cotton and soy, are grown from GMO seeds. This is not something that we have to worry about as some unknown quantity. This is something that's used regularly every day without these kind of cataclysmic consequences. So just to go on to that sort of philosophical angle, I think it's very much linked to a sort of Rousseauian view of the state of nature. But before we had technological progress, we were kind of frolicking in the trees and everything was nice, and civilization brought all these problems. But I think that just goes back to almost this biblical view of a puritanical view that, you had Adam and Eve and everything was great, when actually that's a story about how sin is inherent in the world. It's not meant to be viewed literally like everyone was happy before we had technologies, before we had warmth, before we had clean water. So, there's still so much we can do. The American Economic Review found, GM crop adoption had only reached a third of its potential. So we can push this forwards, far further. GM crops can improve soil health, carbon sequestration, drought resistance, disease resistance. So this anti-progress environmentalism, we see it in so many guises: anti-nuclear, anti-population, anti-growth. These people seem to be sickened by society. What are they actually for? So I ask you, reject the misanthropy, reject the hatred of progress, embrace technology, embrace the future, embrace optimism, and embrace GM crops.
Okay, thank you. Right, Ed's for thoughts.
Thank you. Firstly, I'd like to echo what Harry said about xeon lights. Sorry, get the correct pronunciation, but he's absolutely right to emphasize that. And I make the same comment. I think it's really important when people examine the facts and look at the truth and change their mind, and you get a degree of vilification or unpleasant treatment. But therefore, it's beholden upon those of us who agree with where they've changed their minds to support you and congratulate you. So I wanted to echo that. I also agree with some of the philosophical underpinnings that Harry was mentioning towards the end there. And I was wondering how I could, crowbar not just Thomas Malthus, but Adam Smith and the dissolution of the monasteries into how we've developed this kind of overly pro-worship of nature kind of Gaia Earth that we seem to have that's part of the problem. But I'll come back to that in the Q&A if it becomes relevant, I think. For me, I remember when GM foods were first coming up. It was the late 90s, the early 2000s. And I remember instinctively saying this Frankenstein food thing that was scaring people from eating it, and why the GM food lobby doesn't like labeling too much is because if people know it's GM produced, they tend to have that immediate reaction where they won't eat it. And that sort of has that visceral power. But I remember thinking at the time, no, this is about eugenetic pollution or the cross-fertilization or the intragenetic mixing, however you want to phrase it. Genetic pollution might be too strong a term. And I think that is the real problem with GM foods. I think that is the reason that it hasn't been taken up in this country, and it's the reason it hasn't been taken up in other countries. And I think that's one of actually strategic and tactics, which you may come on to after me. But just briefly on that, I think really with that, you have to take the hit. It is a real thing. If stuff rapeseed cross-fertilizes into weeds, creating what gets called the super weeds, you've given this plant more resistance, and therefore that extra resistance goes across to weeds, then you've got a problem. And that's been understated for understandable reasons. But I think the problem is actually that both the foods and the legitimate concern about the cross-genetic thing has harmed the whole debate, particularly because of the golden rice thing. I think the golden rice is a classic example of where you absolutely want to move ahead with genetically modified food as fast as possible wherever you can. What's interesting about that, and it goes back to what Zion was saying, she asked the green activists why they were against it. The point is, and I think you agreed with them as well, and I agree with them as well, which is that you want to create a society where actually you don't have to genetically modified food to ensure that children aren't going blind. We don't have to do that. So it's a bit of strategic thinking there, which is actually developing golden rice, particularly in the countries where it's absolutely required for the reasons already given, is absolutely legitimate, but needs to coincide with the development of those countries. That means they would no longer actually need it, in the same way that we don't. I think that's an important strategic point, and that's why I reject this point about should we embrace them fully. I think we should be more open and transparent about the potential negatives in terms of cross-fertilization. As Harry mentioned, they should be dealt with in a regulatory fashion. And my understanding from what he said, and I think this is the right approach, is that if you see that as a problem, then you don't give the go-ahead. Clearly, it sounds to me very clearly that there's not a problem with golden rice, for example. I think the last point to make is that my philosophical problem, is that it's a bit like nuclear power, and the green technologist argument for nuclear power is we need it because we're going to have a climate crisis. Or we need GM foods because population is going to reach 10 billion. I think that we need to get the catastrophizing out of these arguments altogether, wherever they appear, so that we can discuss these policies properly. We're not going to hell in a handcart in either of these cases, whether it's population or the climate crisis. And then we can all have a calm assessment of what actually should be the right policy. And I've suggested it's yes to golden rice, but no to other things which will lead to cross-fertilization.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much. Adam.
So that sets me up rather well. I
didn't steal it then.
No, that's great. In the SCP, we don't have a settled policy yet on GM foods. What we can talk about is principles, and we can talk about our determination to do the right thing here. And for me, the principles that we need to bear in mind are respect for science, moral courage, and ambition. I'd like to move the focus away from the sort of the fear and the danger and the risk, because I think for the reasons that Zion and others have set out, we've sort of talked ourselves into a hole here where trust has been undermined, and we're bizarrely over-regulated. So there are international treaties on what materials can cross a border. There are EU treaties and regulations on what can be done within each of the member states, many of which have come across onto UK statute. There are devolved powers within the UK, so that should the Tory change to the rules around this last year, should that be enacted, and it's still up in the air about whether it will be or not, the Precision Breeding Act that they snuck through last year. If the Labour Party decides to go ahead with that, then they'll have an almighty fight on their hands, because Scotland and Wales can both say no. They will have their own handbrake on the bus. So all the way down the chain. You'll even find it in the sort of trading standards regulations in your local authority. There will be column inches going off, more than you want to read about proper labeling and telling your local kebab shop what they've got to stick on the menu to show that it's horrendous. So we've got to think about how we deal with all of that, and to, in a way, over regulating is, in my view, what is now sustaining the lack of trust. I think if you look at these food labeling issues that a number of us have touched on, why would we want to put GM origins in amongst all of the other things? I'm just thinking about the buying British, the labour conditions, the soil conditions, the pesticides, the nitrites runoffs, the calories, the air miles, the biodiversity, the allergens. I mean, it's like, how much fear do you need on your food, right? And I think if we could pull back to that sense of moral courage and focus on the science and rebuild people's trust that the government is actually working in their best interests, then we could have a much more sensible attitude towards this stuff. It can be done. The US has just changed the way that they manage their GM regulations to be very much more risk-based. So rather than just a sort of blanket approach, everything's scary, everything's got to be tested 100 times. In the US now, they say, if you're doing something truly novel, which has a demonstrable risk profile to it, it'll get the whole treatment. If you're doing something that's been done before in a slightly different way or in a slightly different combination, there's no scientific reason to expect any different result from it. They'll go for a much lighter process to get these materials through. And the first item that they've got through, which I think was towards the end of last year, was the purple tomato, a lovely nutrient-enhanced tomato developed at the John Innes Centre in Norwich. We've got the most incredible biotech capabilities in the UK. I know it's some real world-class stuff. Those tomatoes can't be grown here, and we should be up in arms about it. We need a much better regime, I think, to make sure that we're at the forefront of that, showing the world what's possible, and embracing a much more sort of ambitious pro-science attitude to this area.
Brilliant. Thank you.